All right, welcome to the deep dive. For this one, we're tackling a book you sent our way, Why Leaders Lie: The Truth About Lying in International Politics by John J. Mearsheimer. As always, the goal is to kind of break down this dense material and pull out the most important bits for you. And given what we see every day in the news, the whole issue of truth and lies in global affairs, well, it just feels more relevant than ever, doesn't it? I mean, think back to something like the Iraq War. The whole world was debating whether leaders were telling the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, Mearsheimer himself says in the book that one of the big reasons he wrote it was because there wasn't really any serious academic work on this topic. Like, the role of lying in international relations, it's a huge deal, but no one had really dug into it. So he wanted to provide a framework, a way to analyze why leaders choose to be, shall we say, less than honest on the world stage. Oh, and he does give credit to his colleagues and editors for helping him sharpen his arguments.
Right. Which shows this isn't just some off-the-cuff opinion, but a really carefully thought-out analysis. Now, one thing that really surprised me reading this was Mearsheimer's argument that lying between states, like one country lying to another, is actually not as common as we might think.
Kind of counterintuitive, right? I mean, you'd think in such a high-stakes environment, deception would be everywhere.
It does go against that kind of cynical view of international politics as just a never-ending game of lies. So yeah, in this deep dive, we're going to unpack that apparent paradox. We'll look at what exactly counts as lying in this context, the different types of lies, the strategic logic behind them, when they're more or less likely to happen, and what the real-world consequences can be. All right, so let's get into it. So before we get into the specifics of international lying, we need to make sure we're all on the same page about what exactly we're talking about. Mearsheimer starts by making a distinction between simply trying to be accurate and actively trying to mislead.
Yeah, that's crucial. He defines truth-telling as making a genuine effort to present the facts honestly, recognizing, of course, that everyone has their own biases and limits to their knowledge. It's really about the intention to be truthful. Deception, though, is a broader category. It's when someone intentionally tries to prevent others from knowing the full truth as they see it. And within that, we have lying, concealment, and spinning.
Okay, so lying is a specific type of deception. How does Mearsheimer define it specifically?
For him, lying is making a statement that, or strongly suspect, is false with the intention of getting others to believe it. So it's a deliberate act of presenting something as true when you believe it to be untrue. He also makes the point that lying isn't always about specific facts being wrong. It can also involve arranging true facts in a way that intentionally leads someone to a false conclusion.
Gotcha. So it's not just about saying something factually incorrect, but also about manipulating the truth. Right. That makes sense. Now, how about concealment and spinning? How are they different from just flat out lying?
Well, concealment is simply withholding information. You're deliberately not sharing the full picture, but you're not actually saying anything false. Spinning, on the other hand, is a bit more active. It involves highlighting certain facts and downplaying or ignoring others to create a specific narrative, usually one that's more favorable to you. So the underlying facts might be true, but the way they're presented is distorted. That quote, Ajabalia, often attributed to Tiger Woods, right? You can always tell the truth, but you don't have to tell the whole truth. That really captures the essence of spinning.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's about selective emphasis to shape perception. Mearsheimer uses a really helpful analogy to illustrate this: the courtroom.
Oh, right. He contrasts a witness under oath who's legally obligated to tell what they believe to be the truth with the lawyers on each side. Now, the lawyer's goal isn't necessarily to present the absolute unbiased truth, but to build the strongest possible case for their client. So they emphasize the evidence that helps their case and downplay the evidence that doesn't. They're essentially spinning the same set of facts to tell different stories, but they're supposed to stay within the bounds of factual accuracy. They shouldn't be straight up lying to the court.
Ah, that's a great way to visualize it. The witness is going for full truth, while the lawyers are working within the rules to shape the narrative. And it seems like there's this feeling that spinning and concealing are somehow more acceptable than just lying directly. Why do you think that is?
Well, Mearsheimer suggests that detectability is a key factor. A well-crafted lie is designed to be believed and therefore harder to expose. But with spinning, the audience is often more aware that they might not be getting the complete picture. They can see what's being emphasized and what's being left out. They can, if they're suspicious, dig a little deeper and look for different perspectives. So there's a better chance of the spin being recognized for what it is.
Okay, so there's a degree of, I guess, potential transparency, or at least a lower bar to uncovering the deception with spinning. Now, what about this concept of business bluffing? Does Mearsheimer see that as different from lying in international politics?
He's pretty clear on this. He basically says business bluffing is just lying if you're intentionally giving false information to get an advantage. He argues that it's the intent to deceive with a false statement that makes it a lie, regardless of whether it's common practice in, say, negotiations or business dealings.
No free pass for diplomats, then, even if it's considered standard practice. And it sounds like even when leaders feel they need to deceive, they usually prefer to use spinning or concealment rather than outright lying.
Yeah, that's a key point. There's a huge stigma attached to being called a liar, and lying is inherently risky because there's a good chance you'll get caught. So leaders will typically opt for spinning or concealment if they think those methods can achieve their goals. But of course, Mearsheimer acknowledges that there are situations where leaders might feel lying is their only option, especially if they think they can get away with it. But generally speaking, it's probably a last resort.
All right, so we've got our definitions down. Now let's dig into the core of Mearsheimer's analysis. The different kinds of lies he identifies in international politics. He talks about an inventory of 7 types, each with its own purpose.
That's right. He breaks international lies down into 7 categories, though he points out that sometimes one act of deception can fall into multiple categories. So for the sake of completeness, they are lying between states, fear-mongering, strategic cover-ups, nationalist myths, liberal lies, social imperialism, and misleading to facilitate spying or sabotage. We might not have time to get into all 7 in detail today, but it's good to have that framework in mind.
Wow, that's a pretty comprehensive list. So let's start with lying between states, which is kind of what we were talking about earlier. You know, that famous quote about ambassadors and all. But you mentioned that Mearsheimer argues this type of lying isn't as common as we might think. Why is that?
Well, he basically argues that there are some serious constraints on leaders when it comes to lying directly to other states. For one thing, it's just plain hard to pull off. I mean, other countries have their own intelligence agencies, their own diplomats, and they're all operating in a global system where trust is already in short supply, especially when it comes to security issues. Everyone's on the lookout for signs of deception. Plus, even if a lie works in the short term, the long-term cost of being found out can be huge damage to your reputation, loss of trust, and it can even make future diplomacy much harder. So yeah, it's kind of a surprising insight. Leaders actually lie to each other less than we might assume, mainly because they're under such intense scrutiny from other countries. The risk of getting caught often just outweighs the potential benefits.
So the cost-benefit calculation and the risks are usually just too high. But you said it does happen sometimes. What's the main reason why states do lie to each other when they do?
Mearsheimer says the fundamental motivation is to gain some kind of strategic advantage in a world that, as international relations folks call it, is characterized by anarchy. That basically means there's no central global authority to enforce rules or guarantee security. So in this kind of self-help system, states are mainly concerned with their own survival and power. And sometimes they think deception is a necessary tool to achieve those goals.
I guess that makes sense. If everyone's looking out for themselves, there's got to be a temptation to lie to get ahead. So what are some examples of situations where states might lie to each other?
He gives several scenarios. One is concealing weakness to deter a potential enemy. Like, a country might downplay its economic problems or military limitations to avoid looking vulnerable. Or, on the flip side, a state might exaggerate its strength to deter an attack. Think of the Cold War missile gap, where both the U.S. and the Soviet Union sometimes overstated their nuclear capabilities. Another situation is downplaying hostile intentions to avoid provoking a response. He talks about how those early Cold War defense pacts in Europe, while officially about guarding against a resurgent Germany, were really more about containing the Soviet Union. But leaders weren't totally upfront about that primary motivation because they didn't want to unnecessarily antagonize Moscow.
So managing perceptions to avoid escalation. What other examples does he give?
Well, he also talks about misleading about military operations for tactical advantage. Like during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Nixon, who was running for president at the time, had to publicly criticize the idea of invading Cuba, even though he knew about covert plans for something similar. Because, if he'd let on that he knew, it would have tipped off Castro. Or, similarly, during the Iran hostage crisis, President Carter's press secretary, Jody Powell, deliberately misled the public about potential rescue attempts so they could maintain the element of surprise. And then there's lying to allies about a rival's threat to get their support. The Bush administration claimed in 2005 that North Korea had sold uranium enrichment technology to Libya when it was actually Pakistan. That was probably an attempt to get China, Japan, and South Korea to take a tougher stance against North Korea. Oh, and misleading to help with spying or sabotage is another one. The initial denials about the U-2 spy plane incident are a classic example.
So those are all cases where the perceived strategic gain was worth the risk of getting caught in a lie.
Exactly. And of course, strategic deception in wartime is pretty much standard practice. Mearsheimer mentions how FDR believed that misleading, even lying, might be necessary to win World War II. Deception is often seen as a legitimate tool of war. It's interesting, though, he says he didn't find many clear historical examples of leaders lying or bluffing during formal diplomatic negotiations, which is kind of surprising, right? You'd think that would be more common, but maybe those cases are just really well hidden.
Yeah, maybe so. So it seems like lying between states, while not the norm, does happen in specific situations, mostly when there's a strategic advantage to be gained, especially when the stakes are really high, like during a war. Okay, let's move on to the next category, which is fear-mongering. The name kind of speaks for itself, but what exactly does Mearsheimer mean by it?
Well, he says fear-mongering happens when leaders see a potential threat, but they don't think they can get the public to understand the danger and support the necessary policies without exaggerating it. So it's about amplifying the perceived threat to get public backing. There's a great quote from Dean Acheson, who was Truman's Secretary of State. He said that when trying to rally support against the Soviet Union after World War II, you had to make arguments clearer than truth. That kind of sums up the whole mindset. And the goal isn't just to sway the general public, but also to influence experts and even government officials who might be underestimating the danger. The thing is, it often works because of the imbalance of information. The public often just has to trust their leaders on these complex issues.
So it's about creating this sense of urgency, even if it means stretching the truth. And the justification is usually that it's for the greater good.
Exactly. Mearsheimer argues that fear-mongering has been a go-to tactic in U.S. foreign policy, especially in the lead-up to wars. He points to several presidents who used it to overcome public resistance to military intervention.
Can you give us some of the key historical examples he uses?
Sure. He talks about Franklin D. Roosevelt and the USS Greer incident in 1941. Roosevelt told the American people a story about what happened between the U.S. destroyer and a German U-boat, but it was very different from what actually happened. He made it sound like a completely unprovoked attack. He didn't mention that the Greer was actually tracking the submarine with a British plane that had already dropped depth charges. And he falsely claimed the Germans knew it was an American ship. He also said publicly that the U.S. wasn't looking for war, but privately he told Churchill he was willing to provoke an incident.
Wow, that's a big difference between what the public heard and what was likely going on behind the scenes.
It is. Another big example is Lyndon B. Johnson and the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. The Johnson administration made it seem like they were totally certain about an unprovoked attack on the USS Maddox by North Vietnamese patrol boats, but the Maddox's own commander wasn't even sure if there'd been an attack at all. And they also said the Maddox was on a routine patrol and that the attack, if it happened, was deliberate and unprovoked. But the truth was the destroyer was gathering intelligence for South Vietnamese operations against North Vietnam, so, it might have been seen as the aggressor.
So again, the story told to the public left out important details and downplayed uncertainties. And then, of course, there's the build-up to the Iraq War under George W. Bush.
Right. Mearsheimer lists a bunch of claims made by the Bush administration that he sees as fear-mongering. First, there was the assertion that Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda were close allies. Then Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld claimed to have bulletproof evidence for this, but it turned out to be nothing, and the 9/11 Commission even refuted it. Then there were the repeated claims that Saddam definitely had active WMD programs, even though there were serious doubts within the intelligence community and no solid proof. They also kind of hinted that Saddam was somehow connected to the 9/11 attacks, even though they never said it directly. They wanted to plant that idea in people's minds. And finally, various officials, including Bush himself, said they were still trying to find a peaceful solution, even though it seemed like they'd already decided to go to war.
It seems pretty clear that the goal of this kind of fear-mongering is to get public support for a specific action, like military intervention.
Yeah, that's the idea. By making the threat seem bigger than it is, leaders try to rally the public and silence any dissenting voices among the elite. When the public is scared, they're more likely to go along with whatever the government wants to do and less likely to question things.
And Mearsheimer says it's often surprisingly easy to lie to the public this way. Why is that?
There are a few reasons. Firstly, governments have access to tons of information, like intelligence data, that the public doesn't have and can't check for themselves. And leaders, especially the president, have a big platform to shape public opinion through speeches and the media. Plus, there's usually a basic level of trust between citizens and their government. People generally want to believe that their leaders are acting in their best interests and telling them the truth. That makes them more vulnerable to manipulation.
But what about the possibility of backlash if these lies come out? Doesn't that make leaders think twice?
Yeah. Mearsheimer says that deterrent isn't always very strong because leaders often think that they can get away with it. It can take years, even decades, for lies, especially in foreign policy, to be fully exposed. He uses the example of President Kennedy's secret deal during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The full truth didn't come out for over 30 years. By then, the political consequences had mostly faded away.
So are there specific circumstances when elites are more likely to resort to fear-mongering?
Yeah, regime type is a factor. Democratic leaders are directly accountable to the public, so they might feel more pressure to exaggerate threats to get the support they need for their policies. Plus, there's this historical view, especially among some foreign policy experts, that the public is often too isolationist or too willing to appease aggressors, so they need to be scared into recognizing dangers. Geography matters, too. Countries like the United States, which has historically been an offshore balancer, might be more likely to fearmonger about faraway threats because they might not seem as real to the public. And finally, fear-mongering is especially common when leaders are thinking about preventative wars because they need to make the threat seem urgent to justify attacking before it's actually immediate.
It's really interesting how all these different factors, both domestic and international, can create the conditions for fear-mongering. Okay, let's move on to our third category, strategic cover-ups. It sounds like this is about hiding mistakes or controversial actions after the fact.
Exactly. Strategic cover-ups are all about deceiving the public, and sometimes other countries too, about policies or actions that are controversial or have failed. The goal is usually to protect the government's image, keep public support, or avoid negative consequences. The main difference between this and lying between states is that the target audience for a strategic cover-up always includes the domestic public.
Gotcha. So it's about managing the narrative after something has happened to control the damage from decisions that might be unpopular or seen as mistakes. Can you give us some examples of strategic cover-ups that Mearsheimer talks about?
Sure, there are some really striking examples. One is the Israeli government's response to the Kibbutz massacre in the 1950s. Prime Minister Ben-Gurion publicly blamed the killings on extremist Jewish groups, but Mearsheimer calls that narrative wholly fictitious. It was designed to deflect international condemnation and avoid criticism at home. Then there's the Kennedy administration's denial of a secret agreement to remove U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey as part of the deal to end the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's often called a noble lie, intended to prevent a public backlash and maintain the perception that the U.S. had won. Germany's hiding of its military training in the Soviet Union between the world wars, which violated the Treaty of Versailles, was another strategic cover-up. They did that to avoid criticism from both the German left and the Allied powers. He also mentions the British government's attempts to downplay and deny the abuses that happened in the Kenyan gulag for Mao fighters during the colonial era. They didn't want the public to turn against their colonial policies. And then there's the long-standing U.S. and Japanese policy of keeping secret the agreements that allowed U.S. nuclear weapons to be stationed in Japan during the Cold War.
Those examples show how strategic cover-ups can be used for a variety of reasons, from managing international relations to protecting domestic political standing. So, under what circumstances are they most likely to happen?
Mearsheimer says that some of the same things that make lying between states more likely, like a dangerous geopolitical situation, being involved in crises or wars, dealing with rivals, also makes strategic cover-ups more likely, especially when the deception involves foreign audiences as well. But two things really stand out. First, strategic cover-ups are super common during wartime because the stakes are so high and admitting failures can be devastating for morale and public support. Second, they're also really common in democracies. Democratic leaders are more accountable to public opinion, so they might feel a stronger need to hide policies that are controversial or haven't worked out, especially if they go against what the public wants. So the need to manage public perception is a bigger driver of strategic cover-ups in democracies.
Okay, so we've looked at lying between states, fear-mongering, and strategic cover-ups. It's fascinating to see the different motivations and who they're targeting. Maybe before we wrap up, we could briefly touch on the potential downsides of these different types of international lying.
Definitely. Leaders might see lying as a useful, even necessary tool in certain situations, but Mearsheimer emphasizes that there can be serious risks, particularly what he calls blowback. Fear-mongering and strategic cover-ups, because they involve deceiving the public directly, are the most likely to erode public trust in the government and undermine the rule of law if the truth comes out. If people start to think that their leaders are constantly lying to them, especially about important stuff like international affairs, it can create cynicism and make them less engaged. That can weaken the very foundations of a democracy, and the effects can go far beyond just foreign policy.
Yeah, that makes sense. If the public loses faith in their leaders' honesty on the world stage, it can breed distrust in all government institutions. What are the other categories of lies Mearsheimer talks about? Do they carry the same risk of domestic backlash?
That's interesting. He argues that nationalist myths and liberal lies tend to have a lower risk of domestic blowback. With nationalist myths, there's often already a desire among the population to believe the positive story about their nation's history and role in the world, so these lies might not even be seen as lies. And with liberal lies, where a state misrepresents its actions as more virtuous or aligned with liberal values than they really are, even if the public sees times when their country has acted against those values, they might tend to compartmentalize it. They might think that international relations operate under different rules than domestic affairs, so it doesn't necessarily lead to widespread anger or distrust at home. And lying between states mainly risks damaging a country's reputation and making future diplomacy harder. It doesn't usually impact domestic trust in the same way. But it's important to remember that even these other forms of lying can have long-term consequences.
So it's this complex calculation of potential benefits versus potential costs, and the type of lie makes a big difference to the nature of those risks. Mearsheimer really highlights this tension between the perceived need for lying in certain international situations and the potential dangers, especially the erosion of public trust. And this brings up a really important question for you, the listener. Given this tension, how should we evaluate our leaders' statements about foreign policy? And what can we do to encourage more transparency and accountability in this crucial area? It's a really tough challenge, and there are no easy answers.
Yeah, no easy answers. But understanding the different reasons why leaders lie in international politics and what the consequences might be is an essential first step for citizens who want to engage more thoughtfully and critically with their leaders' actions on the global stage.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Mearsheimer's Why Leaders Lie. We hope it's given you some valuable insights into this complex and always relevant topic. Keep those questions coming, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.